a phrase that describes the way similar things or beings tend to appear and grow together. Imagine a patch of grass and wildflowers that all sprout in the same corner after the rain, or a group of people with the same hobbies forming a tight circle. It speaks to natural clustering, like attracts like, and life of the same kind often gathers and flourishes in one place. Maya lived on the fifth floor of a narrow building that leaned toward the street like someone listening in. Every morning, she walked past a small community garden squeezed between a coffee shop and a laundromat. In spring, when the city was still cautious and polite, the garden burst into visible life, green shoots, tiny blue flowers, a brave tomato vine curling up the fence. It felt as if the ground had a social calendar, and everything that belonged together found the same day to arrive. She called it the garden's little law. When one kind of plant decided to show up, its kin would not be far behind. A line of mint, then mint's cousins in the corner, a cluster of daisies, then a low carpet of clover that seemed to have RSVP'd late. Maya liked the regularity. It was comforting to see order in the small things, a reminder that some patterns held steady even when her inbox did not. Maya worked as a product manager at a startup where clustering looked different but felt the same. Teams divided themselves by temperament. The engineers formed a tight, low-voiced knot in the back room, favoring logic puzzles and caffeine that tasted of metal. Designers gathered in bright, scattered groups with sketchbooks and a habit of sketching in the margins of printed spreadsheets. Salespeople visited the biggest tables, laughter trailing behind them like balloons. The office celebrated its clusters. Find your people, HR would say. And the new hires did. They joined Slack channels that echoed their hobbies: photography, Slack, late night running, plant rescue, and found quick comfort there. Those channels were modern garden beds, each one attracting the things it was meant for. At first, Maya enjoyed belonging. She loved how similar minds pushed one another, how conversations became deeper because the assumptions were shared. Projects moved faster when everyone used the same shorthand. Jokes landed perfectly because they came from a common place. The startup grew. Ideas fit together like sections of a map. But one afternoon, while sipping tea and watching a clump of sunflowers tilting their faces toward the same thin sun, Maya overheard a conversation that lodged in her like a stone. Two colleagues were discussing a feature critique. The designers, she realized, weren't surprised by the engineers' objections. They expected them. The engineers, for their part, had stopped asking why the customers wanted something different. They assumed the market would adapt to the product's logic. In their comfort, each cluster had softened its edges. They had stopped testing the line where their world met another. Maya thought of the garden again. A patch that is only one species can be beautiful, but it can also be fragile. A single pest, a change in weather, a new footpath, all could undo it. Diversity, she remembered from botany classes she never finished, made systems resilient. Mixed roots hold soil. Different leaves shelter one another. So she started doing small things differently. She invited a neighbor she had only waved to for 2 years, an elderly man named Louis, who repaired bicycles on weekends, to a product demo. She asked the junior designer to join a customer interview she would normally watch alone. She suggested a walking meeting outside, to the community garden, so people could see something alive and messy and unarranged. People at first moved with the awkwardness of seedlings reaching for light that isn't where they expected it. The engineers questioned the relevance of the gardener's stories about soil. The gardener, in turn, wondered aloud why a user would care about a loading spinner. Then, slowly, they began to find places where their interests met. Lewis's bicycle patch method of simplifying problems fixed the frame, then worry about the paint, made an engineer try a simpler architecture. A designer, inspired by the gardener's way of layering shade and sun, suggested alternating features in the app to guide attention, rather than shouting everything at once. Outside the office, Maya noticed similar shifts. The community garden became a place where people who tended similar plants swapped stories, but also where different kinds of neighbors crossed paths. A teenage musician left a discarded amplifier by the fence and came back to find a retired teacher had started using it as a planter. A group of volunteers turned a corner of the garden into a tiny library of seed packets and handwritten notes about what grew well in the city. Strangers became familiar because they shared small care, trimming, watering, rescuing a struggling basil plant from the heat. The more Maya nudged these crossings, the clearer a pattern emerged. Clustering was not a problem to be stamped out. It was a force of nature, efficient, encouraging, comfortable. But if life only ever clustered with itself, it risked narrowing the world into predictable rows. The trick was to let clusters form and flourish, while also weaving new paths between them, walkways that connected beds, fences with hinges that opened, invitations that read like casual experiments. At a company retreat held at a repurposed warehouse, they practiced this idea. Teams were shuffled into groups that had never worked together. They spent a day doing a swap exercise. A designer became the customer for a morning. An engineer sketched mock-ups in the afternoon. And Maya spent a few hours with the marketing team writing headlines. The day felt disorienting and strangely thrilling, like moving from your neighborhood into the next one and finding a different rhythm. Ideas mingled. Solutions that had been stubborn in one place unlocked in the company of a new perspective. By autumn, the garden had a lattice of footpaths that cut across the old straight rows. Some people still tended the same patches, as is natural, but they stepped out more often. On a Saturday, Maya watched a group of kids plant a mix of wildflowers and vegetables in a long, collaborative bed. One child asked why they were mixing them. An older volunteer smiled and said, "Because different friends protect each other. When one needs shade, the other gives it." Maya carried that image home. It felt true for people as much as for plants. Ideas and people that gather together create strength and comfort. But life was richer when those gatherings also stretched outward, when the edges were porous and curious. Months later, when a big change hit the company, a market shift that made their main product less useful, the teams did not crumble. The clusters had not disappeared. But they had learned to lean on one another across the paths Maya and others had built. Engineers who had once been content with elegant solutions now talked to customers who had patiently been invited into the garden of ideas. Designers who loved aesthetic coherence had learned the resilience of messy experiments. The company pivoted, not because everyone agreed at once, but because different clusters could share what they knew and try things together. On a chilly evening, Maya walked past the community garden. The wildflowers had given way to seed heads and gathered frost. But the paths were clear and the beds looked alive with stories. She sat on a low wall and watched a small group, an engineer, a gardener, a teenage musician, compare notes over a thermos of tea. They laughed at a joke that came from 3 different angles. For a moment, Maya thought about how neat it would have been if life followed only one pattern, one comfortable line. Then she looked at the scattered, entangled plants, the ways roots had learned to include one another, and felt something steadier, belonging. Yes, but also the courage to cross over. The garden did what it always did. It let things grow where they wanted. And it gave people a place to notice. Clusters formed. Clusters met. From that meeting, something else grew, a neighborhood of small experiments, a company that could change, a community that could keep learning how to be together.